Hello, it's April 25th and this is the New Arab Weekly podcast from the New Arab in London. Each week we take a look at the biggest stories of the week and ask what happened and what does it all mean. Joining us to unpack the last 7 days in the Middle East, we have Senior Editor Nadda Osman.
Hello.
And Associate News and Features Editor Zainab Mehdi.
Hello.
The news never stops, but we can try and catch up. On with the show. On last week's episode, we spoke about Iran's attack on Israel, and on April 19th, Israel launched an attack on Iran in response to their drone and missile attack 5 days earlier. The central Isfahan province was targeted, but the damage appears to have been limited. The recent strikes have raised tensions in the region, with many worried that a wider conflict could be ignited. Following the attack, US Secretary of State Antony Blinken was quick to distance the US from any responsibility.
On the first question, the reports that you've seen, I'm not going to speak to that, except to say that the United States has not been involved in any offensive operations. What we're focused on, what the G7 is focused on, and again, it's reflected in our statement and in our conversation, is our work to de-escalate tensions, to de-escalate from any potential conflict.
So this attack was launched on Friday the 19th, in the early hours of Friday the 19th. As it happened, air defences across Iran in multiple provinces were activated. The Iranians reported that they shot down 3 small drones. Hours after the launch was reported, senior US officials said, confirmed that Israeli missiles had hit at least one site in Iran. During in the hours preceding and during the attack, flights across Iran, including from Tehran airport, were all suspended. But that only lasted for about 4 hours or so, and then they were all resumed afterwards, which may be irresponsible or not, but that's what they did. There were also explosions reported in both Iraq and Syria, and with multiple military-related sites in Syria being targeted, although that is kind of par for the course when it comes to Israel and Iran. There were reports of 3 explosions in or near Qajaravestan city. Iran said that they shot down a number of sort of smaller drones. The general consensus is that Israel fired a small number of missiles from aircraft that were actually positioned outside Iranian airspace, rather than, and that the small attack drones, known as quadcopters, were sent into Iran essentially with the idea of confusing Iranian air defenses. That was according to unnamed Israeli officials. I mean, that certainly seems to have worked, given that those quadcopters were shot down. Probably one of the most notable things about this attack was the location, right? Isfahan province is right in the center of Iran. They didn't go anywhere on the outskirts or anything like this. It was right in the center of Iran. Isfahan province, there's a few very important things in Isfahan province. Firstly, they have the Iran's uranium conversion facility, which is all to do with nuclear stuff, both nuclear power and other more nasty nuclear things. And the Natanz uranium enrichment site is also in the province, which again is very nuclear weaponsy. There are other military bases which are very important to the regime. There's a whole fleet of F-14 Tomcats fighter jets, which are actually American fighter jets and are all very old now because they were all purchased by Iran before the revolution in 1979. Israel did undertake this attack, for sure, although they have not commented on it. But that is kind of standard for the course when it comes to Israel. They don't generally confirm and say, yeah, that was us. Apparently, the US was given advance notification that the strike was going to happen. But we just heard from Secretary Blinken, they did not green light this, sort of quote unquote, this attack, and were very quick to say this is nothing to do with us. Hours after the explosion, Isfahan was reported as being very calm. So it was big, it was impactful, it was also simultaneously small and not impactful, certainly in terms of like damage caused and that sort of thing.
So do you think that Israel achieved everything that it wanted?
Yes, probably, right? I think the thing that they wanted is to send a message. They wanted to send a message saying, you know, you attacked us, now we're going to attack you. They certainly did that. They did that by striking right in the heart of Iran as well. They said, yeah, we can get through everything and anything you put up in our way, and we can hit you. In that sense, they did send their message, certainly. I think there is an argument to say that, you know, this was muted as attacks go, considering how bad it could have been and the capabilities of Israel and their air force and their missiles and all other such things. There is a chance that it could have been more than that, but it wasn't.
Why do you think they held back, if they did?
I think they certainly did hold back. I think so. Why did they hold back? Because Americans. I think the Americans basically said, no, right? You cannot go as far as you want to go, because all they want to do, the Americans don't want to get involved in a war between Iran and Israel. I don't think that actually most sensible minds in the Israeli government want to get involved in a war with Iran. It's not in their interest. I mean, certainly not while operations are still happening in Gaza. Certainly not while, you know, Hezbollah's still there, and even the Houthis, you know, down the road. I mean, there are certainly people in the Israeli government who do want a war with Iran, the real hawks. Itamar Ben-Gvir, in a social media post, said that the suspected Israeli airstrike on Iran was weak, which, you know, does show that there are minds in the Israeli government who do want more. And it does seem that the US and probably, you know, European allies as well said, no, you can have something, you can do something, but you can't, you know, start bombing nuclear facilities, which is something that they probably want to do. You can't start, you know, bombing civilian areas. Probably, I'd imagine, stay away from the capital. Don't bomb Tehran. That would be a bad move. Before all of this happened, you had both the British Foreign Secretary and the German Foreign Secretary go and meet with Benjamin Netanyahu in Jerusalem. And you can bet that this was, and that was after the Iranian attack, you can bet that this was a hot topic of conversation. And I'm sure they went and said, you can do something, but no, you cannot, you know, flatten Tehran. You can't, you know, they do have nuclear weapons. You can't use those. It can be something, but it's limited. And that's what it was. It was something, but it was limited. And it did, I mean, for the most part, Iran ignored it. You know, state media came out and said, oh, Isfahan's really calm after only a few hours after the attack. So I think it kind of sent the message and also did actually help to probably de-escalate tensions, I would imagine.
And do you think this is going to cause divisions amongst Israeli officials? Maybe some of them want a stronger reaction against Iran, while others think, you know, we're already kind of busy and preoccupied with what's going on with Gaza.
Yeah.
What do you think?
It has all the potential to, right? I really do. I think a lot of it will come down to it. You had the Iran strike and you've now had the Israeli strike. They're kind of level pegging one for one now. If Iran chooses to strike back from this, that will be trouble. I think for the moment, the more sensible minds within the Israeli government and within the Israeli military will say, let's move on from this. We're back at the same equilibrium they are now, that they were sort of before, actually even before April 1st when they struck the consulate. We're back almost to that. Let's stick with that for the moment. And let's not forget, the Israelis are going to carry on doing what they were doing before April, which essentially they're probably going to keep targeting. They've already been targeting Hezbollah, south of Lebanon. They're going to keep targeting the Iranians in Syria, and they're going to keep targeting Iranian-backed groups in Iraq. So that's all kind of the same for the same, I would imagine. That's what I think. If Iran chooses to strike out at Israel again, particularly Israeli territory, then I think those sort of voices within the Israeli government, within the Israeli military, who say, let's go at it with Iran, could become certainly louder and certainly have more ears listening to them, I would imagine. But let's frankly hope that it doesn't come to that, because that wouldn't be good.
So could you talk more about the damage caused?
Yeah, I mean, not extensive, really, frankly. Some satellite pictures were taken. It would seem that the most important thing they hit was a radar facility that is used by Iran's S-300 missile systems, which are a Russian missile system. That seems to be the main thing. There were reports that maybe they hit other things. These were denied, and it's not really sure what the actual damage was. That seems to be, this radar system seems to be the main target that was hit. Everything else seems to be pretty inconsequential. I mean, it could have been a lot worse for the Iranians, certainly. Could have maybe gone better for the Israelis if they wanted to do more, but maybe they didn't. I think probably in hindsight they didn't. So I think it probably worked out. I mean, considering, 7 days ago, 8 or 9 days ago, the entire region was incredibly concerned about an outbreak of war, a really consequential war. That does appear to have dissipated, at least for the time being. But mistakes happen all the time. So that, I think, is obviously of great concern.
So what has the international reaction been like so far?
Mainly, stop, please stop. Let's not go any further with this. That's the main thing. I mean, Jordan says, retaliations must end. Hamas was the outlier, really, and sort of called for actions to be expanded, but that kind of makes sense. Iraq, deep concern. Italy, absolute de-escalation. The G7, who've just been meeting, said all parties need to work to prevent further escalation. The UN, it's high time to stop the dangerous cycle of retaliation in the Middle East. It was all much for the same, really. The IAEA is the International Atomic Energy Agencies. They said that there was no damage to Iran's nuclear sites, sort of confirming what everyone suspected. But they said they were monitoring it closely and said that nuclear facilities shouldn't be military targets. But it was also mainly the same for everybody. I mean, even China said they've noted the reports and opposes any action that further escalates tensions. Lavrov from Russia said, we very, very clearly outlined in these conversations and conveyed to the Israelis that Iran does not want to escalate. So it was really all much the same for the same. And I think we can only hope that those voices are listened to and we don't go any further with this.
We will not stand for this. This movement extends far beyond the militarized gates of Colombia, beyond the city of New York, to the students of Gaza, whose classrooms have been burned to the ground. Shame! As Jewish students, we know what scholasticide and cultural genocide looks like. And as students, as Jews, and as human beings, we must do everything in our power to end it.
That was a student speaking from the large-scale pro-Palestine protest encampment which started at Columbia University last week. The protest has had a ripple effect across the US and around the world. The protesters, who are demanding the university divests from companies with ties to Israel, have been met with heavy-handed crackdown from the university. Hundreds have been arrested and suspended across the US, and Columbia University has announced that all classes will be delivered online for the rest of the semester. So what we're seeing around the US is a huge, unprecedented protest, which started at Columbia University last week and now has, like I said, rippled across the country and around Europe as well. Students have been setting up tents across campus grounds, mainly demanding a ceasefire, but also divestment from Israeli companies and also financial transparency from the university. Now, Columbia University's president, Namat Shafiq, has sent a campus-wide email saying that she's called police to clear the encampment due to disruption caused. And she's also formed a working group, which, in her words, is to bring the crisis to a resolution.
That will definitely work. What ties do Columbia have with Israel, actually?
So they have a connection to a campus in Tel Aviv, which students have been very vocal about. And the university has actually responded by arresting students on the campus. So far, the NYPD have arrested 109 students from Columbia, but this has also kind of triggered protests around the country. And now another 100 have been arrested at Emerson College in Boston, which is quite significant because this is the first time this has happened in decades. And another 60 students have also been arrested at Yale as well.
It seems like a PR disaster for both the police, who, of what I understand, don't have a good rep in the US to start with, and the universities.
Yeah, you're right. And the police have been very heavy-handed. There's videos of them kind of dismantling tents, using batons. There's been police on horseback in some cases, and also reports of journalists being arrested as well. So it's kind of sparked debate over free speech in the US. And, at NYU, administrators have also kind of constructed this wooden wall to block entry into the School of Business. And students are calling it the NYU Wall of Shame or the Apartheid Wall.
That's a reference to the wall in the West Bank, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Obviously, alongside all the sort of news that we've been seeing from these universities, I suppose people on, say, the other side have been pretty vocal about anti-Semitism and sort of accusing a lot of these students of engaging in anti-Semitism and anti-Semitic actions. Is there anything to that, do we think?
The protests have been largely peaceful, with many of them, just chanting Free Palestine. Biden has actually condemned the protests and called them an example of blatant anti-Semitism. Netanyahu has called them horrific, and he's also kind of encouraged the universities to take even stronger action. He's called their response shameful so far.
For a long time we've had this sort of conflation between anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism. It's happened in the UK, it's happened in the US, it's everywhere. It's something that's been going on for a long time. Is this all sort of coming to a head now, do we think, on US campuses? Particularly in light of the war on Gaza?
I think what we're seeing is, definitely this younger generation and students clearly being able to tell the difference between anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism, especially considering, the social media coverage coming from Gaza. It's been very eye-opening for many, many people, and it's forced them to question things that they're seeing from the media, and it's cutting through any kind of propaganda. However, the US government's stance is still kind of conflating the two. And, some are arguing that they're effectively trying to silence Palestinians by conflating the two. It's also worth noting that throughout this past period, the US has been providing military aid to Israel.
Just past some, no?
Yeah, that's correct. So Biden has just signed an aid package which includes $26 billion to Israel, and around $4 billion of that is dedicated to replenishing Israel's missile defense systems.
I'm sure they definitely need that. Who actually are these? All just students from Columbia University and from these universities, or are these organised groups?
So it's a mix, to be honest. It's mainly students from the universities. There's a big portion of Muslim students and Jewish students, but it's also been organised by a number of groups as well. So, for example, Students for Justice in Palestine and the Jewish Voice for Peace. But there's also been a number of community figures and public figures have been attending these protests. So, for example, Mu'taz Aziza from Gaza, who evacuated, I think, after 108 days of covering the war on Gaza. There's also been Sheikh Omar Suleiman, who is a prominent Muslim scholar and who's been also very outspoken about what's happening in Gaza as well. So it has, garnered a lot of coverage and reaction worldwide, as well as in the US. And just on that note as well, I think it's triggered protests around the world. So earlier this week, we saw protests at the American University of Cairo, which were quickly kind of quelled by staff and security forces. The electricity was cut, but we've also seen protests in Australia this week and in France as well, where police were called as well to kind of disperse the protesters.
And just out of curiosity, in the past, what role have student campus protests played in changing history? And do you personally see the current pro-Palestine protests contributing towards important changes?
Well, if we look historically, there have been a number of large-scale student protests across the US. And I think the point that a lot of people are making at the moment is that it's reminiscent of the anti-Vietnam War protest around 50 years ago, where students were protesting at Kent State University against the expansion of the US invasion of Cambodia. Now, by this point, around 50,000 Americans had already been killed, and the National Guard was called in to disperse the protests, and 4 students ended up being killed, and it became known as the Kent State Massacre. Now, since 2013 as well, we've seen several Black Lives Matter protests across the US as well in universities. So there is a history of these student protests, and they have been quite significant.
Yeah, I think there's been a few people who sort of have been drawing those comparisons between the protests we're seeing today and the Black Lives Matter protests. I do wonder why. I mean, do you think that do we have any sense that these protests from the campuses are getting through to the wider general public, do we think? I mean, because it's not the same. I mean, I get like the anti-Vietnam protest comparison, but there they were, Americans dying abroad for a war that they didn't agree with, whereas these are Palestinians. They're not American citizens who are dying abroad. Again, for a war they don't agree with, but they're not totally the same there. So do we think they're getting through?
I think what's garnering an even bigger reaction is the crackdown and the force of American police on the students. I think the fact that now it's triggering this debate on free speech and violence against largely peaceful protesters is what's going to cause an even bigger reaction. And I think it's also worth pointing here that Palestinians and protesters at these protests keep highlighting the fact that this should not be a bigger story than what's actually happening in Gaza. Yeah. I mean, we've seen this week that over 300 bodies have been discovered in a mass grave, so that they keep highlighting that they shouldn't be the focus, essentially. And, the focus should still be on Gaza and Israel's actions over there.
Yeah. Our final story today, I think we've briefly touched on it already earlier, but it comes from you, Zainab.
As Israel continues its bombardment of Gaza, this week's harrowing discovery relates to more than 300 bodies being retrieved from 2 of the largest hospitals in Gaza, one of them being Nasser Hospital and Al-Shifa. This discovery comes after Israeli forces withdrew on April 7th. The UN Human Rights Council on Tuesday have said more bodies were found at Gaza City's Al-Shifa Hospital. So what has been found so far? Women, children, patients and medical staff. Gaza's Civil Defense Group on Monday said it uncovered many of the bodies from what appear to be temporary graves inside the Nasser complex as Israel's siege prevented access to cemeteries. Ravina Shamdasni, a spokesman with the UN's Human Rights Office, has said some of the bodies found at the Khan Yunis hospital were found with their hands tied and stripped of their clothes. I think here it's important to define the term mass graves. I think it's important to define what mass graves are. It's important to realize and remember that mass graves are not burial sites or final resting places. throughout history, they've represented places of atrocity or mass death.
You said that some of these bodies have been, some of the bodies that have been found have had their hands tied, they've been restrained. What's been the sort of international response to that? Has the UN said anything?
Yeah. Before I delve into the UN response, I would like to touch on Palestinian commentary. Gaza's government media office has blamed Israel for the mass graves, describing their discovery and the overall situation at Nasser Medical Complex as a heinous crime. In their statement, the office said storming it twice and destroying some of its parts demonstrates the extent of the barbarism of this occupation and the immorality of the army, which destroys all aspects of life and means of survival inside the Gaza Strip. The statement also proposed and called on the prosecutor of the International Criminal Court to investigate the massacre in all its details. So in terms of the UN response, they've called for a clear, transparent and credible investigation of mass graves uncovered at the two hospitals. UN spokesman Stefan Dujarric has said that credible investigators must have access to all sites. In terms of a US response, in Washington, US Department of State spokesman Vedant Patel described the discovery of mass graves as incredibly troubling, adding that US officials asked for the Israeli government for information.
I mean, that has been such a common theme of, like, we have news of an appalling atrocity in Gaza, and then the Israelis say, oh, well, we can have an investigation, and the US say, yes, we must have an investigation, and that's the last we ever hear of it. Do we think this is going to be the same again?
So it's unlikely that this investigation will be permitted, especially if we take into account Israel's previous uncooperative behavior. And on that note, on Tuesday, despite the US State Department spokesman Vedant Patel, expressing concerns about the mass graves, they've actually refused to support the UN call for a probe into the mass graves in Gaza. And when asked, for example, about potential support for a probe, Patel reiterated that the administration is awaiting information from the Israeli government. And after Patel stressed that the administration has asked Israel for more information, one journalist inquired, and do you believe the government of Israel is a credible source in enlightening you? The response was, we do. So despite the uncertainty of whether Israel will allow an investigation, the EU have supported an independent probe. The EU spokesman, Peter Stano, has said this is something that forces us to call for an independent investigation of all the suspicions and all the circumstances, because indeed it creates the impression that there might have been violations of international human rights committed. That's why it's important to have independent investigation and to ensure accountability.
Just on that note, Gaza's civil defense today said that some people may have been buried alive since they had medical tubes attached to them still. What's Israel's response been to the discovery of the mass graves? And can we trust that, they're going to allow any investigations into them?
So the Israeli army said in a statement on Tuesday, 23rd of April, that the claim that it buried Palestinian bodies was baseless and unfounded. The army further added that during its operation in the area of Nasser Hospital, bodies buried by Palestinians were examined to try to locate the Israeli hostages and missing persons. They further added the examination was conducted in a careful manner and exclusively in places where intelligence indicated the possible presence of hostages. So personally, I don't think, as I mentioned before, an investigation will be permitted. But I believe with further, force, further pressure, an investigation may take place. And as you already spoken about, people expressing the concerns of the mass graves at the Columbia protests, I think, further pressure will actually potentially result in an investigation, hopefully.
I think it's it's good that the EU wants to have an independent investigation. I mean, it doesn't really matter how independent it is. It still has to rely on, access being granted by Israel, who aren't going to allow access at all. I mean, and also I think Israel have claimed that it was Palestinians who dug the mass grave, which really overlooks the point that a mass grave was needed in the first place, You don't normally need to have mass graves unless a huge number of people are being killed or dying. So I think that really sort of overlooks the real vital point here.
Can we also point out that this has just surfaced right after Israel put the hospitals under siege? We saw we all saw the harrowing images of Al-Shifa Hospital completely blackened and some of the buildings, reduced to rubble. I mean, their claims are absolutely ridiculous.
I mean, this also isn't the first mass grave either.
No, it's
I don't
not.
know. I've lost count now of how many we've had reported, but this is not the first. I fear it won't be the last either.
So there's been a lot of media coverage on the mass graves now, and it's also picked up a lot of, attention and reaction from around the world. Do you think this is going to be a major turning point?
In my opinion, no. Since the start of October 7th, we've seen a number of harrowing images and discoveries come through, such as the famine, Palestinians witnessing forced displacement, starvation, and even with those revelations, nothing has changed. So I don't think the discovery of mass graves is going to actually change anything.
I mean, they've not been held accountable for anything, even considering the International Court of Justice ruling in South Africa, and still we've seen several actions that show that it's plausible that this is a genocide.
Yes. I mean, we had the strike against the international aid workers as well.
Yeah.
Which caused a lot of condemnation at the time, but that's disappeared quite quickly as well.
And that included British citizens as well, and American and European citizens, and still they've carried on carrying out these atrocities.
I do fear that, and maybe it sort of ties in with your story, Nadda. I do fear that until there is an impact for sort of these Western politicians at the ballot box, they're not going to bother, and they have no reason to change their stance at all. But we will wait and see. Obviously, what's happening with the mass graves around Al-Shifa and Nasser Hospital Complex, really, really shocking. At the same time, the world is gearing itself up for what could be further shocks as Israel is setting its sights on Rafah, it would seem. Zainab, fill us in.
So at present, more than 1 million have taken shelter in Rafah. Israel said on Wednesday that it is moving ahead with its ground invasion into Gaza's southern city. And they've also said, particularly the military, have said that they are organizing a mass movement of the civilians into tents in Khan Yunis, which is actually against the advice of humanitarians who have warned that conditions are not suitable for living amid a collapse in sanitation and the destruction of buildings. So
obviously the mass movement of people is going to be, I would imagine, a logistical nightmare, both for the people who are going to be, many would have fled Khan Yunis in the first place and moved down south for safety, and now going to be forcibly moved back to Khan Yunis, are in desperate need of humanitarian aid, are in desperate need of food, of shelter, of medical assistance. I fear I know the answer already, but is there any hope that humanitarian organisations will be able to reach these people once they're in Khan Yunis and once the Israelis are moving into Rafah?
So the top Red Cross official, Fabrizio Carboni, has already said that it does not appear to be possible to evacuate the Palestinians sheltering in Rafah under the current conditions, and it would be a difficult attempt in the time frame of the expected Israeli invasion. And, he specifically said, that the probability of a major operation in Rafah is increasing. And when we see the level of destruction in the middle area of Gaza and in the north, it's not clear to us where people will be moved to, where they can have decent shelter and essential services. So today, with the information that they have and from where they stand, they actually don't see this massive evacuation as possible. And separately, Jan Egeland, the chief of the Norwegian Refugee Council, told AFP that everybody seems to be on the countdown to war across the largest displacement camp on earth, which is Rafah. And he even added that the invasion would create a terrible situation.
Yeah, I think that is sadly all too predictable.
I think it's also clear that Israel has proven not to care whether they're targeting areas with civilians in or not. I mean, we've seen them across Gaza, especially in the north.
Time and time again, yeah.
Time and time again, yeah. They're just completely brutalizing and leveling entire neighborhoods, not allowing people to evacuate safely. And even when there has been, safe zones or areas coordinated by Israel and, designated as safe, they're still targeting people in those areas as well as aid workers. So how they're asking people to evacuate is just, I feel like it's nonsense, really. I think, also people that have no choice and no options. I mean, getting into Egypt, for example, through Rafah is beyond expensive. It's, $10,000 for some people, and it's just not feasible.
To bring this sort of almost full circle back to my story, after the Israeli strike in Iran, there were, let's say, unconfirmed reports that essentially a backroom deal had been done between the Israelis and the Americans, by where the Americans would say, you have to do a limited strike in Iran, and in exchange, we will let you go through with your plans in Rafah, which, to their credit, and the US don't deserve a lot of credit, but to their credit, they had been voicing up, saying, if you're going to go into Rafah, it needs to be on a much more sort of surgical basis than it has been previously. Whether that was ever going to happen anyway, as realistic for the Israeli army to follow through on that is very debatable. But
I think, again, take that with a pinch of salt, because, America has, come out and said these statements from the start and, urged Israel to hold back in some cases. But at the same time, they're, giving Israel military assistance constantly.
It's a sad situation, and unfortunately, I think it's only going to get worse. Okay, a few other stories from the week. There's this one from today. US neither confirms nor denies regular meetings with Assad. The US has neither confirmed nor denied whether its officials have been in discussion with Syrian President Bashar al-Assad after claims made by the dictator in a televised interview. It's been clear now, sadly, for quite a while that President Assad of Syria has really won the Syrian civil war. He still remains pretty much an international pariah. Do we think maybe this is signs that we're heading for sort of the complete normalization of the Assad regime?
Well, I think there's definitely something strange going on here. The US is saying that they won't comment on private diplomatic discussions, but then Assad has said that they've been meeting from time to time. So the US has also kind of denounced any relationship with Assad. So I don't know.
I do wonder whether this is. You would hope. I imagine there are some ties here to Austin Tice, who is a US citizen that they believe is still being held by Assad after many, many years. But I think a lot of this also will come down to the ongoing war in Gaza. And if they can get Syria to not get involved, that's good for the Americans. Another story here, Malala slammed for co-producing musical with Hillary Clinton. Malala Yousafzai, a prominent Pakistani activist and Nobel Peace Laureate, has come under fire for working with former US Secretary of State Hillary Clinton on a new Broadway musical. It's called Suffs. It's about women's suffrage and follows the history of the fight for women's rights to vote. Do we think Malala Yousafzai should be working with Hillary Clinton?
Absolutely not. I think it's shocking, especially considering Clinton oversaw the drone strike campaign on the Taliban, which killed other children in the village that she's actually from. And I think people are also criticizing her over her silence on Gaza, saying that they can no longer defend her. And just today she issued a statement kind of clearing her name and trying to save face, clearly from a PR disaster, and people saying that actually there wasn't any confusion about her stance and that she's outwardly been pushing US propaganda.
Yeah. We have a question from a listener. You can send your questions into us, podcast@newarab.com. But we have had a question from a listener. John emailed in. He asked, why do powerful Arab states not come out and openly support the people of Palestine? It's a good question.
Well, I think that one of the number one reasons is obviously normalization. We've seen in recent years a number of Arab states now having diplomatic relations with Israel, including the UAE, Bahrain, Morocco, Jordan. Egypt also has ties to Israel, so that's one factor. There's also been conversation about if and when Saudi will normalize ties with Israel, and that's something that the US has kind of been pushing in recent weeks and months, trying to make it happen. Other than that, economy is a major factor. So, for example, Lebanon still has memories of the civil war there. They're also in the midst of an economic crisis. So they're not really looking for war. Egypt is the same. And I think it's the same across the board, really.
Yeah, I would say in answer to your question, John, money is a big part of this. These countries, or a lot of them, while they might not have direct economic ties or strong economic ties with Israel, they are all reliant in a large part on the US. So they have to go with the US because they need the money from the US and support from the US. And that's why they won't come out so vehemently. I think there's also ties back to our first story is there is a desire by a lot of these nations not to sink the entire region into a huge conflict. I think there's certainly a strong argument to say they could be doing more.
Definitely, 100%.
They certainly could be doing more.
In terms of like sanctions and, all of these different things, that there could be a lot more being done. But there may also be a fear of what it could do to the region in terms of refugees and the Palestinian right of return. There's 1.4 million people currently in Rafah. Where are they going to go? And if they do settle in these countries, we've seen in Jordan the amount of Palestinians that are already residing there.
Yeah, I think it's a big fear for Jordan because, you get a lot of far-right Israeli politicians who say there doesn't need to be a Palestinian state because a Palestinian state already exists. It's Jordan, and that's where they should all go. And the Jordanians, I think, understandably say, well, no, it's not. We're Jordan. We're not Palestine. And the Palestinians also say, we're not Jordanian. We are Palestinian.
There's also been efforts to try and push them into Egypt, which is a humanitarian corridor in any other kind of conflict might make sense. But in this case, it doesn't because Israel has a long history of forcing Palestinians out of Palestine and into exile.
Yeah.
So I think the current situation is actually going to affect Saudi-Israeli normalization. Just 4 weeks ago, Saudi officials have been calling for a halt to the war and led Arab nations in accusing Israel of committing war crimes in Gaza. They fear that the brutal images emerging from the shattered territory will radicalize their young people. And, even Elham Fakro, Associate Fellow with the Chatham House Middle East and North Africa program, who was working on a book about normalization, has said that the Gaza offensive has dramatically shifted that dynamic. In her own words, she said, it's safe to say that the Palestinian cause is back at the center of popular consciousness and support for normalization with Israel is at an all-time low. This will complicate Saudi Arabia's ability to sell a deal to its citizens and the broader Arab and Islamic world.
I do think there are a number of Arab leaders out there who are probably quite worried that doing nothing, could lead to, be the spark that leads to mass protests that the region has seen before against Arab leaders.
Absolutely, and we've already seen Egypt kind of clamp down on protests there.
Yeah, and that backfired.
Yeah.
When they arrested those people, it really backfired.
Yeah.
That was, for context, they arrested anti-war protesters in Egypt.
Same with Jordan as well.
Same with Jordan, and it's backfired in both occasions. So they are, I think, trying to tread a very fine line, and they do risk falling off. A lot of good stuff happening on the New Arab's website this week. I've picked out one here from the analysis desk. It's by Kian Ward. Undo the Damage. How a new ad campaign in Lebanon is fueling violence against Syrians. New billboards began popping up nationwide in March with TV spots airing on MTV. It's a Lebanese TV channel. carrying a rallying call that, quote, the Syrian displaced issue needs immediate action. Well worth a read if you can get round to that. Nadda, what have you got?
My pick this week is from the Opinions Desk, and it's an article titled "With Prayer Ban, British Muslim Children Become Latest Target of State-Sponsored Islamophobia." And it discusses how a UK court's ruling in favour of a school in London banning prayer rituals is part of a wider pattern of discrimination against Muslims in the mainstream political discourse.
Excellent. And Zainab?
And mine is from the News Desk, titled "Houthis Threaten to Expand Red Sea Operations After Mass Grave Discovered in Gaza." This article discusses Yemen's Houthi rebels threatening to expand their military operations against Israeli-linked ships in the Red Sea and Indian Ocean following the discovery of the mass graves in Gaza.
Excellent. All well worth a read. Thank you for joining us for this episode of the New Arab Weekly. This week we were joined by Senior Editor Nadda Osman and Associate News and Features Editor Zainab Mehdi. We'll be back next week and every Friday after that. Our other podcast, The New Arab Voice, there's a new episode out. It should be in your feeds by the time you hear this. We're going on a short break, but we will be back in the future with more episodes. You can subscribe to both The New Arab Voice and The New Arab Weekly on Apple, Spotify and wherever else you get your podcasts. Be notified when a new episode drops. Until then, if you have any questions for us or stories that you would like us to cover, drop us an email, podcast@newarab.com, or find us on social media @TNA Podcasts for all the latest news. You can subscribe to the show so you never miss an episode, and you can also rate and review, which helps us spread the word. Don't forget to follow The New Arab on Facebook, Twitter and Instagram for all the latest news, analysis and opinion from the region.